So I didn't think that I had to say this, but apparently I do. You should never go into the Wyoming wilderness alone. And if you need a good reason, let me tell you about when 24-year-old Amy Bechtel learned that lesson the hard way. On July 25th, 1997, at 1 in the morning, Amy's friends found her car abandoned on a remote mountain road in Shoshone National Forest. The doors were unlocked, her keys, sunglasses, and handwritten notes were sitting inside the car, but Amy, well, she was nowhere to be found. And as strange as that sounds, the scene at first appeared to explain everything. Amy was an elite runner who was training for a race, and it looked like she had simply just parked and then headed into the wilderness for a run and then hadn't returned for some reason. But when the authorities arrived and began searching the area, they started to ask a far more disturbing question. Had Amy actually disappeared during a run, or had someone carefully arranged the scene to make it look that way? A strange vehicle had been seen nearby. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts of Amy's moments before her run, and when her husband finally reported her missing, he opened that 911 call in a very bizarre way, a way that left investigators wondering what really happened that night way out in the Wyoming wilderness. Amy was born on August 4th, 1972 in Santa Barbara, California. She was the youngest of 4 siblings, and she grew up in the town of Jackson, Wyoming, where she became an incredibly kind and driven person. Amy's determination showed up early in her life. For example, when she joined her high school track team, she wasn't like a naturally talented runner, but she worked harder than almost everyone else. And by the time that she graduated, she had become one of the team's best runners, and she took that same determination to the University of Wyoming, where she convinced the cross-country coach to let her join the team without a scholarship. And by the end of college, she would certainly have proved herself. She earned a partial scholarship, and she still holds the school's indoor 3,000-meter record, which is an incredible accomplishment. And speaking of accomplishments, this accomplishment isn't nearly as impressive, but regardless, I am trying to accomplish my goal of reaching 1 million subscribers on this very channel. If this is your first time watching me, I'm gonna do my best to earn your sub by the end of this video, and if you're a regular viewer and you haven't done so yet, please hit subscribe right now. We're so close to 1 million. I appreciate all of you. Now, despite everything she accomplished in her athletic career during college, the most important moment of her college career came in December of 1991, because that's when Amy met someone who would go on to change her life forever. This was, of course, Steve Bechtel. Steve was a fellow student and also a pretty serious rock climber, and him and Amy quickly fell in love. They were both drawn to the outdoors, and they were always looking for their next adventure. And after graduating, they got married and settled in Lander, Wyoming. The perfect place for people who loved climbing and running, hiking, all the outdoor stuff, right? They worked part-time jobs and then spent the rest of their free time outside in the mountains. And eventually, Amy set her biggest goal yet, which was qualifying for the 2000 Olympic marathon trials, which is like super impressive. I mean, it's very obvious that Amy believed she could do just about anything, right? And then in July of 1997, Amy and Steve bought their first home, and it really seemed like the beginning of like their happily ever after, you know? But that was not to be the case, because just 3 days after they bought that house, their love story took a horrifying turn. On July 24th, 1997, Amy woke up ready for what she expected to be a pretty busy day. She and Steve both had the day off, but neither one of them was the type to just sit around and do nothing. I think I made that pretty clear. And so at around 9:30 in the morning, Amy told Steve that she was leaving to go teach a weightlifting class at the Wind River Fitness Center. And then after the class, she planned to run several errands. She'd originally intended to drive 185 miles north to Powell, Wyoming to pick up some furniture from her parents' house, but she'd called her mother the night before to apparently postpone that trip. And honestly, looking at everything else she had planned for this day, it's easy to see why there just wasn't enough time. Since the couple had just bought their first home, Amy needed to set up utilities, arrange phone service, and handle all of those little details that come with, you know, moving and owning a home, as many of you know. And in addition to all that stuff, if everything stayed on schedule that day, of course, Amy also planned to drive into Shoshone National Forest to train for a 10K race that she was helping organize. And so clearly this was a very ambitious itinerary for one day, but that's exactly how Amy liked to live, right? Again, Steve also had the day off from work, and so he had plans to drive roughly 70 miles north of their house, where he and a friend named Sam Leitner Jr. wanted to scout a rock formation they had been hoping to climb. And so they kind of had their separate plans for the day, and at approximately 2:30 p.m., Amy stopped at a store called the Camera Connection in downtown Lander to drop off some photographs. Add that to the list for the day. And during this stop, an employee noticed that she was acting like a little bit weird. Like she was frequently checking her watch while in the middle of their conversation. She was dressed in running clothes, and she was clearly moving nonstop from one errand to another. After spending a few stressed minutes in the store, Amy quickly left out the back door, apparently. Now, from the accounts that I've read, it's possible that Amy was in a hurry to leave the camera store so that she could finally get up into the mountains and go for her run. Again, Amy had been training for a 10K hill climb race that was going to take place along Loop Road in Shoshone National Forest. And Amy never specifically told Steve that she planned to go for a run that afternoon, but to him, there was nothing unusual about this at all, right? Running was simply a part of her everyday routine, and Steve said that Amy telling him that she was going to go for a run, quote, would have been like telling me she was going to brush her teeth. It was just an ordinary part of her day, so ordinary that he didn't even think it was worth mentioning. However, looking back now, I wonder if Steve wishes that maybe she had. Because if she had, well, maybe things would have ended up a little different, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So Amy wasn't planning like a crazy long run that afternoon. She had been battling some painful shin splints. I know some of you know what that feels like. And so the workout was meant to be relatively quick and easy. Her plan was pretty simple. She was going to drive along Loop Road, use her car's odometer to measure the race course. Again, she was involved with the planning and the organizing of this race. And then she was going to park her car, go for the short run, and then head home in time for dinner with her husband, Steve. And so she was driving along the road, and eventually she reached an area near where the final stretch of the race would be, called Fry Lake. And that's where she parked her car and then set off on foot, presumably. Now, to go back to Steve for a second, again, he was supposed to go on this like climbing scouting trip with Sam, but eventually they decided to abandon this trip because the approach was becoming more difficult than they were expecting, and there were even some dark storm clouds beginning to gather overhead. And so they called it a day early and headed for home. At roughly 4:30 p.m., Steve pulled into the driveway, and things were quiet. In fact, probably a little bit too quiet. Amy's car wasn't there where he expected it to be. It looked like she hadn't arrived home yet. And in hindsight, it would be very easy for me to like play this up as an eerie moment and wave my arms around a bunch, but the truth is that Amy's absence didn't immediately raise any alarms to Steve. There had been multiple times in the past where she had simply lost track of time when she was outdoors, and so Steve had no reason to believe that anything was wrong. I mean, he fully expected her to walk through that door just about any minute. But then, those minutes, well, they turned into hours. And as moonlight began to shine over the wilderness of Wyoming, Steve started to realize that something was very, very wrong. He began trying to think of any explanation as to where Amy might have been. You know, maybe she decided to actually drive to her parents' house after all. I mean, sure, it was 185 miles away, and she had like a zillion other things to get done that day, but I don't know, maybe she just really wanted to pick up that furniture for their new home. And so with this speculation, Steve called Amy's parents, but they hadn't seen her either. And so Steve quickly reminded himself that it would have been extremely unlike Amy to make a trip like that without telling him. Of course, right? At 7 p.m., Amy and Steve's friends, the Skinners, stopped by to invite them to a movie, and they quickly noticed that Steve was extremely worried. And so he explained that Amy had gone out earlier in the day, possibly to go run, and that she simply hadn't returned. Like, what the hell is that? He was obviously very worried at this point, but maybe still in denial a little bit. That's me editorializing, but that's kind of what it seems like, because the Skinners actually offered to go help look for Amy, but Steve at this point suggested that they go ahead to the movie, by themselves, and he would stay back in case Amy walked through the door. But later that night after the movie, the Skinners came back right around 10:30 p.m. And when they talked to Steve, it was very clear that he was like in full panic mode by this point. Amy still hadn't come home, and there was no denying it at this point. Everyone agreed that something was seriously wrong. And so the Skinners again offered to begin searching, and this time Steve took them up on that, and Steve stayed behind just in case, once again, Amy actually returned. And it was at this point that Steve finally made the phone call that he'd been dreading all evening. He picked up the phone, he dialed 911 so that he could report his wife missing. Like, oh man. Like, obviously that call would be incredibly difficult for anyone to make, but as we're soon going to find out, the way that Steve reported his wife's disappearance, well, it immediately stood out to investigators. I don't know how else to say it. I know this story is already like super weird, but I promise it's about to get even weirder. Oh, and speaking of weird, one of the weirdest parts of being an adult is discovering about every 6 months that you've been doing something in your life completely wrong. So apparently you're supposed to rotate your tires, clean the filter in your dishwasher, and not let your savings sit around earning basically nothing. And that last one brings me to today's sponsor, Chime. Chime's high yield savings account earns 3.75 APY, which is 9 times the national average. So in normal person numbers, $10,000 in savings would earn about $382 over a year, compared with about $38 at the national average. That's a $344 difference just for changing where the money sits, which happens to be exactly my favorite amount of effort. And there's also no minimum balance requirement and no monthly fees. Chime can also help with the money that you spend. The Chime card lets you earn 5% cash back in a category that you choose, whether it's groceries, gas, dining, travel, and plenty more, and you can change it every single month. Now, groceries would be the obvious pick for me because somehow I can spend $80 at the grocery store and still come home with absolutely nothing to eat. Like what is that? Right now, new members can earn up to $350 with a new Chime checking account through my exclusive link. So scan the QR code, click the link below, or go to chime.com/KyleHatesHiking. Make sure you use my link so you're eligible for that offer. So one more time, click that link. And thank you so much to Chime for sponsoring this video. Let's get back to the story. So Steve Bechtel picked up the phone to call 911 to report his wife missing. And when he did this, I don't know. Again, I wasn't on the phone, obviously, but it was very strange. Steve apparently said, like right at the beginning of the call, quote, "Hey, this is Steve Bechtel calling. I'm missing a person, and I'm wondering if you maybe have an extra," which that's actually kind of funny. But remember, his wife was missing here. He was literally calling to report her missing. Is that really the situation to make a joke? I don't know. I've never been in that position, but that's weird, right? Steve's behavior on this phone call would eventually end up under the microscope, but at that moment, word was quickly spreading among law enforcement that a woman was missing in the Wyoming wilderness. And at the same time, the Skinners were driving in the pitch black darkness along Loop Road. They peered through their windshield at the dense wilderness on the roadside, hoping to find any sign of life of their dear friend. And just when they were ready to give up in frustration, their headlights suddenly shined over the outline of a familiar shape. They kind of squinted at the mysterious shadow and let their eyes focus on exactly what they were looking at. And then their stomachs dropped. And perhaps their hearts skipped a beat because they both realized that what they were looking at was a white Toyota station wagon parked in a turnout at Burnt Gulch, which is a long way of saying they had found Amy's car. The Skinners pulled over immediately, expecting and hoping to find Amy somewhere nearby, but instead they were greeted with this unsettling silence. The car was completely abandoned, essentially. The doors were unlocked, which might sound weird, but that's not incredibly unusual in this remote part of Wyoming. And everything inside the car appeared remarkably normal. Amy's $120 sunglasses were on the passenger seat next to her handwritten to-do list, and her car keys were even sitting right there too. The only obvious item missing was her wallet, but other than that, there was no apparent sign of a struggle, no broken glass, no sign of a robbery. The scene they found at Amy's car almost seemed like too perfect. Almost like, she clearly ran into the wilderness and then clearly disappeared all by herself. But of course, as most of you know, sometimes it's the clearest crime scenes that should ultimately raise the biggest red flags. Around 1 a.m, authorities called Steve to tell him that they had found Amy's car. And that's when Steve really jumped into action. Steve and his friend Kirk Billings gathered lanterns, a sleeping bag, and some matches, other supplies before heading into the mountains themselves. And by the time that they arrived, flashlights were already sweeping through the trees, their beams cutting across tree trunks and disappearing into the dense wilderness. Searchers moved through the darkness, calling out Amy's name, and then kind of pausing after each shout in hopes of hearing a reply. Like maybe she was injured somewhere and just couldn't walk out on her own. But Amy never called back. They didn't hear any shouts. They didn't hear really anything at all. As the hours passed, more and more friends would join the effort. Well before sunrise and well before any professional search teams reached the scene, a dozen volunteers combed through the forest, convinced again that they were looking for just a runner who had simply encountered some bad luck. I mean, maybe she had twisted an ankle, or maybe became disoriented in the dark, or even been forced off the trail by a bear or something like that. They also continued to search all around the vehicle, and when they did this, something else caught their attention. It was clear that rain had fallen earlier that day, and it appeared that the rain may have washed away any trace of Amy. But still, there was hope at this point. Steve's friend Kirk said that he simply, quote, expected her to come stumbling out of the woods. But the hours continued to pass, and they weren't finding any sign of Amy. And slowly, any bit of optimism that Kirk or Steve or anyone had, well, it was slowly starting to disappear. And it was becoming clear that Amy was not going to be easy to find whatsoever. And this early hunch, well, it was right. By the time the sun came up the next day on July 25th, authorities had launched a full-scale search operation. Fremont County Search and Rescue helped to bring out search dogs. They also brought out experienced climbers, ATVs, even helicopters equipped with thermal imaging, and they spread all across the rugged terrain surrounding Loop Road. Investigators also turned their attention to that handwritten to-do list found inside Amy's car. And this was a little bit significant because along with her long list of errands, they found mile markers and landmarks that appeared to map the upcoming 10K course that she was out there working on. And this was really important. It almost felt like another clue that was too useful because not many missing people leave behind a map that could potentially lead you right to them, right? And so search crews followed Amy's planned route through the forest, nearby drainages, and even expanded the search area until they had covered nearly 30 square miles of wilderness. And yet, despite all of this, they still found nothing. No clothing, no signs of a struggle. It turns out that Amy hadn't really left behind a map after all. This was simply just another dead end. 5 more grueling days passed since the day that Amy had first disappeared, and based on the complete lack of evidence, investigators were starting to come to terms that this was not going to be a standard wilderness rescue case, not even close. They started to think that someone or something may have seriously hurt Amy. But by the time investigators started treating the area near Loop Road as like a crime scene, things had already become contaminated. I mean, hundreds of volunteers had searched the area. Amy's car had been moved at this point, and again, the rain had washed over the scene. Any footprints or tracks or other valuable evidence were likely gone. For 5 whole days, everyone treated this as a rescue, but now investigators realized that they might have destroyed their own crime scene, the one they originally thought told a story that was maybe a little too obvious to be true. As the search grew and investigators began to suspect Amy hadn't simply gotten lost in the wilderness, the Fremont County Sheriff's Office brought in the FBI to provide additional manpower, investigative expertise, and specialized resources. Now, I've covered a lot of stories, and I gotta say that the FBI's involvement in this case is a little bit unusual. In all my research, I couldn't find if there was one single discovery that prompted the FBI to join the search. I don't know, they just kind of jumped in pretty suddenly a few weeks after Amy first disappeared, sending over 20 different agents to land her. And I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I've only seen the FBI step in if they really believe that there was foul play of some kind, not just on a normal wilderness disappearance. But whatever their reasoning for coming all the way out to Wyoming was, their initial job was to reconstruct Amy's final day minute by minute. Who had she spoken to? Where had she gone leading up to the trail? Did anyone see anything unusual? And at the same time, Amy's family refused to let the case fade from public attention. Yellow ribbons appeared all over town in her honor, and missing person posters covered businesses and storefronts. Volunteers continued searching through the mountains in the hopes that an adventure-loving person like Amy was capable of surviving out there on her own, and praying that she wouldn't simply disappear without leaving some kind of trace behind. Investigators retraced Amy's final day by interviewing witnesses and, of course, by reviewing her to-do list. And they were actually able to account for most of her day, from teaching a fitness class to running errands and contacting the utility companies for her new home. And they also confirmed that around 2 p.m., Amy stopped at the camera connection, right? Remember that? It's an important part of her timeline, but that's also where her timeline becomes just a little bit unclear. Now, some reports say that Amy seemed rushed and kept checking her watch, and then others say that she appeared completely normal. Hell, one account I read also said that she actually went upstairs from the camera store to another business called Gallery 331, where the owner, Greg Wagner, specifically remembered her looking hurried and stressed out. And it's possible that all these slight variations of the same story are simply the result of years of online retellings and one big game of telephone, kind of. But they also leave a very important question. And I am going out on a bit of a limb here, but bear with me. The question is, was Amy just in a hurry because she had so many things to get done on this day, or was something, or maybe even someone, making her nervous? And while we may not know for sure what happened in the camera store, we do know where she was headed next. Once again, Amy had been mapping the course for that upcoming 10K on Loop Road, and her notes supported that. Investigators originally believed that she parked her car and then went for a run and then vanished, of course. But once detectives started to suspect foul play more seriously, they had to explore other possible theories. For instance, was it actually Amy who even parked the car there? Or maybe had someone else driven it to that spot in Burnt Gulch? I mean, the scene almost felt too perfect, the placement of the vehicle, the clear notes, and the to-do list left in plain sight, and not to mention the location itself. Well, all of those things painted the picture of a very routine training run. And again, I'm speculating here, but if someone wanted investigators to believe that Amy had just simply vanished into the wilderness, it all might be exactly the kind of story that they'd want to create. But that theory would be put to the test once witnesses started to tell investigators about what they saw that day on Loop Road. You see, as news of Amy's disappearance began to spread, witnesses started coming forward with reports that they had, in fact, seen a woman jogging along Loop Road that afternoon. And while investigators received numerous tips, one particular account stood out from all of the rest. This witness recalled seeing a lone female runner traveling along Loop Road between Sinks Canyon and South Pass, which is very near Burnt Gulch, where they found her car. This woman was reportedly wearing a yellow tank top, black shorts, a running watch, and Adidas shoes. And that's obviously a very normal running outfit, but this witness also remembered seeing another strange vehicle up that very same road. After the witness drove past this runner, who was presumably Amy, a powerful thunderstorm rolled into the mountains with like remarkable speed. I'm talking heavy rain, lightning, and rapidly deteriorating visibility, which kind of transformed the landscape very fast. I'm talking within a matter of minutes. The conditions became so severe that the witness briefly considered like pulling over to offer the runner a ride, but apparently he decided to just keep driving. And as he left the Loop Road area, he also recalled passing a greenish gray van that was parked along the roadside. And at the time, he obviously didn't think that either sighting was particularly significant, but investigators were eager to determine whether that unidentified van had any connection to Amy's disappearance. But despite extensive efforts, they were never able to identify the van's owner or establish whether it even played any role in this case whatsoever. But even though this mysterious van didn't lead authorities directly to Amy, the witness's account appeared to support the theory that Amy did in fact go for a run on Loop Road that particular day. However, as often happens in these kinds of cases, unfortunately, as the investigation gained momentum and publicity, the growing number of tips that were coming in started to kind of like muddy up the mystery more than they were actually helping. Authorities fielded reports of possible gunshots, even more suspicious vehicles, and even more alleged sightings of Amy. Nearly every single lead demanded their attention, but they largely failed to produce any like real answers, you know? Well, actually, that is until one very specific tip came in and, well, it basically shifted the investigation forever. A different witness reported seeing a blue pickup truck speeding down a remote road with a man behind the wheel and a young blonde woman in the passenger seat, a woman who might have resembled Amy. And more importantly, the witness's description of the other driver forced investigators to shift their attention back to a person they had been quietly scrutinizing from the very beginning of this case. That would be Amy's husband, Steve. According to Steve's story, he was never driving with Amy up on Loop Road that particular day. He said that he had spent the day nearly 70 miles away with his friend Sam scouting climbing routes. And hell, Sam even produced a gas receipt that he hoped would prove where both him and Steve had been. An alibi, if you will. But one problem was that Steve and Sam had apparently driven separately, meaning that the gas receipt only would establish Sam's whereabouts and not Steve's. Investigators also questioned why the two would even drive separately to begin with if they were planning on climbing together. And although none of those details obviously prove that Steve had done anything wrong, they were just strange enough to keep detectives from fully eliminating him as a suspect. And as they looked more closely at his actions that day, they couldn't help but remember that bizarre 911 call Steve made when he first reported Amy missing. In addition to the strange joke that he opened up with, some investigators felt that Steve's voice sounded surprisingly calm and controlled for someone who just had their wife vanish, right? And actually, let me back up. We really can't forget that joke. Once again, when he opened the call, he said, quote, "Hey, this is Steve Bechtel calling. I'm missing a person and I'm wondering if you maybe have an extra." And like, again, I've never been in this situation, thank goodness. And everyone copes with stress in different ways. But I don't know, I just feel like there's a few moments where you really don't want someone cracking jokes. Like for instance, your surgeon right before surgery, or your skydiving instructor right before a jump, and definitely not while you're on a 911 phone call reporting your wife missing. Like, I don't know, it's weird. Detectives felt like Steve's attitude on the call contrasted with how his friends described him, you know, during the disappearance, like how he was visibly panicked that evening. And this only added yet another list of suspicious circumstances that slowly started to point in Steve's direction. And so as the pressure continued to build, investigators brought Steve in for additional interviews and confronted him with the witness statements, all of the questions surrounding his timeline, and his behavior on the phone. However, Steve continued to deny any involvement in Amy's disappearance, but then detectives uncovered a collection of journals that were, well, extremely disturbing, we'll say. Apparently, and like, I don't know, you can't make this stuff up, dude. Apparently, Steve's journals contained some violent themes that referred to women and even possibly referenced Amy. But when these journals were brought up to Steve, he insisted that investigators were misinterpreting them. And I don't know, maybe they were. He explained that the words were simply lyrics he had written for a metal band that he was in, and that they had nothing to do with his real life or his real thoughts or Amy's disappearance, obviously. And like, that's definitely an interesting explanation. And like, I've listened to a good amount of metal music, and so like, I get it. The lyrics can be like, if you ever listen to Cannibal Corpse, like go listen to that and you'll know what I'm talking about here. It's an interesting explanation on Steve's part, but detectives remained skeptical and very suspicious. During one interview, they even went as far as employing a common interrogation tactic where they falsely told Steve that they had like hard evidence proving that he had murdered Amy. And at this point, rather than continue the interview, Steve chose to end it, to walk out, and to retain an attorney. He also declined to take a polygraph test, which only furthered public speculation, right? And investigators later acknowledged that although they never truly developed enough evidence to charge Steve with a crime, they never stopped suspecting him. However, despite all of that, I have to defend Steve for a second here, and I'm going to say something that a lot of you probably were thinking as soon as I told you about Steve, you know, asking for a lawyer and stuff like that. While I myself am no lawyer, a lot of lawyers will tell you that it's actually quite smart to quit talking to police and to refuse a polygraph test if, you know, you're being investigated like this, even if you're innocent, right? In fact, polygraphs are rarely, if ever, accepted as real evidence, at least in the US. And I mean, any lawyer would have advised Steve to walk away when he did, or even earlier potentially. And in addition to all of that, Steve's buddy Sam always backed up his alibi that they were miles away scouting out their next climbing spot when Amy was out in the woods and presumably disappeared. And when it comes to Steve's questionable 911 call, the joke that he made at the beginning of the call at the very least, well, I think it's pretty widely understood that people sometimes use humor as a way of coping with insane amounts of stress. And again, I've never been in this situation, obviously, but I don't know. The joke felt weird to me at first, but after thinking about it a little bit more, I feel like it doesn't raise quite as many alarm bells, at least as it does with some people in some corners of the internet. I don't know. It's weird, but I don't know. It's hard not to view the spouse as a suspect in cases like this because, frankly, quite often they are the guilty party. But let me be perfectly clear here. Steve has never been charged, let alone convicted, for murdering Amy or doing anything involved with her disappearance. And from a less skeptical perspective, you can actually see that he's a victim in this case too. I mean, he lost his wife. He lost the love of his life. And the reality is that Steve wasn't the only suspect in this case, because as the investigation dragged on, it began to focus on a different and a much more dangerous suspect, a man named Dale Wayne Eaton. Dale Eaton was arrested in 2002 for the notorious Lil Miss murder of 18-year-old Lisa Marie Kimball, a murder that took place all the way back in 1988. And during that investigation, authorities searched Dale's rural Wyoming property and found a disturbing collection of trophies and, items that belonged to his victims, sparking deeper looks into his whereabouts back in 1997 when Amy disappeared. When authorities spoke to Dale's brother, he provided information to the Fremont County Sheriff's Office that Dale was actually camping very close to where Amy vanished, and right around the same time too. This dark coincidence only became darker when authorities also uncovered that only 6 weeks after Amy's disappearance, Dale had attempted to kidnap a family at gunpoint in Red Desert, Wyoming, a town that's roughly 2.5 hours south of Lander. The family had pulled over because they had some car trouble, and Dale stopped to help them. Dale told them that he'd drive them to a repair shop, but then suddenly he tried to stab the mother, Shannon Breeden. Shannon's husband, Scott, quickly jumped up and hit Dale on the head with a rifle. And as the two men fought each other, Scott actually ended up stabbing Dale with his own knife. And later, when Dale was arrested, investigators suspected that he was mentally unstable. You don't say. Dale took a pre-agreement in this particular assault, but that incident sure started to paint the picture that Dale may have been on a crime spree in the area right around the same time that Amy vanished. I mean, the connections were just too crazy to ignore. It was all just so unsettling because Dale seemed fully capable of committing a crime like might have happened to Amy, and he also might have had the opportunity to do so. Fortunately, to this day, Dale Eaton is spending the rest of his life in prison for the murder of Lisa Kimmel, but unfortunately, he has refused to discuss Amy's case entirely. And besides that, the authorities never uncovered any physical evidence linking Dale to Amy's disappearance, leaving him as just another suspect surrounded by way more questions than answers. As the years passed, investigators became increasingly desperate. The FBI eventually requested satellite imagery directly from NASA to see if they had captured any kind of, snapshot of the region from back on the day when Amy first disappeared. And when that imagery didn't produce anything new, they kept pushing and even acquired additional images that were captured by Russia's Mir space station. But again, those images didn't lead to any forward progress in the case either. And I want you to think about that for a minute. The authorities were literally trying to travel back in time and space to find any possible lead, but they still came up with nothing. And that was the insane point that this case had come to. It wasn't until 2003, 6 years after Amy first vanished, that the first physical object potentially connected to her disappearance was found in a very unexpected place. In June of 2003, a doctor was hiking along the banks of a river roughly 14 miles from Burnt Gulch when he noticed something peeking out from the dirt next to the trail. If he hadn't been looking in that exact direction in that exact moment, he might have missed it, but by some miracle, that little black object caught his eye. And so he stopped and he squatted down, reached out to pick it up, and as he dusted off this mysterious object, he realized that it was a weathered digital wristwatch. And it was clear that this watch could have been sitting there for, something like 6 years. The doctor turned the watch over to the authorities, but there was no way for him to know that he might have just found the first and only clue to unlocking a case that had been cold for nearly a decade. The watch was a Timex Ironman model, which was the same one that Amy had been wearing the day that she vanished. And so for a brief moment, authorities hoped that the mystery might finally be unraveling. Like, was this the start of the snowball getting rolling down the hill? They submitted the watch for forensic testing and they hoped that it could give them like a new search area to prioritize, right? Or maybe even a new suspect. Who knows what kind of DNA or other evidence they were going to find on this watch. Well, just like the rest of this case, this brand new miraculous lead quickly fell flat. Because despite extensive examination, investigators could not determine whether the watch had actually belonged to Amy after all. It had seemed like such a promising breakthrough finally after all this time, but instead it became yet another crushing dead end. And so after this disappointing discovery, the case went right back on ice. Search teams returned to Burnt Gulch over and again through the years. Divers searched Fry Lake. Detectives continued following new leads whenever they surfaced, but every search ended the same way they always had, with zero trace of Amy, with zero new clues. And as the years passed, that uncertainty became almost unbearable for Amy's family. This is just so sad, man. Her father died, never knowing what had happened to his daughter, and the questions surrounding Steve never completely faded either. Many family members struggled to understand why he had refused a polygraph examination, while others questioned his decision to petition the court in 2004 to have Amy declared legally dead. To some people, those decisions seemed suspicious, but to other people, well, they saw them as the understandable actions of a man attempting to rebuild his life after going through 7 years of heartbreak and uncertainty. Steve went on to remarry, to have 2 children, and he would end up living in the house that he and Amy had bought only days before her disappearance. And to this day, after decades of countless searches, so much investigation, and so many theories, no one has ever been able to explain what happened to Amy Bechtel. Investigators have no idea what happened to her after she presumably set out on that doomed trail run, despite the fact that her abandoned car initially seemed to hold all the answers. That's what it felt like. And so did she run into wildlife? Did she get caught in that storm? Was the scene completely staged from the beginning by somebody? Was she actually showing clear signs of anxiety and fear while she was running her errands earlier in the day? And if she was, why was she so afraid? Why was she so nervous? Or could she have been the victim of a vicious murder spree from an infamous serial killer? I've been thinking about all of this for a while now, and I honestly don't know what to think. Maybe that mysterious watch could still be the key to this whole thing, but unfortunately, authorities just never found any evidence from it. They never found it useful. I really don't know, but somewhere, presumably in Shoshone National Forest, the truth about what happened on July 24th, 1997 is buried deep, deep down there. Like it has to be, right? The only question is, will anyone ever find it? May Amy rest in peace. Please show her some love in the comments section. I always appreciate when you guys are like super respectful to the victims I talk about in this story. And if this was your first time watching me, I hope I earned your subscription, and YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy this video next. And so give it a click, and I will see all of you over there.